swear that your testimony would be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
Good morning, Dr. Greenblatt. Could you tell us what your name is, please?
David J. Greenblatt,
Could you spell your last name for us?
Greenblatt.
How old are you?
2 days short of 70.
I'm not sure you need, at this point, to go through his background
Okay.
or his CV, which has been provided.
Shall I just go right to this
I'll
substance
go
of
right
your
to the
act?
substance of what is being
Thank you.
contested.
Dr. Greenblatt, in the fall of 2014, were you retained by the defense in this case?
Yes,
And were you asked to investigate the effects of PCP on the human brain and human behavior?
yes.
Can you tell us what is PCP?
PCP is the short name for phencyclidine, and it started out in the 40s and 50s of a drug used in general anesthesia to help with alleviation of pain, and then subsequent history.
And does phencyclidine or PCP have a street name?
Yeah, angel dust and other kinds of names.
Okay. And could you spell phencyclidine for the court reporter, please?
Phencyclidine.
Now, how did you go about investigating the effects of phencyclidine on the human brain and human behavior?
Well, the substance was familiar to me in the course of what I normally do professionally, because I normally do research in psychopharmacology, which is the effect of psychotropic drugs on the brain of humans. So I'm familiar with phencyclidine from that, and also because I have to teach drug abuse and medication effects to medical students in graduate school. But I also undertook a review of the peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature.
Now, you said that in the 1950s, phencyclidine was available as a medication?
Yes, a medication used in general anesthesia to help with pain relief.
And could you, and at some point, did that come to an end, the legal prescription of phencyclidine?
Yes, in 1965 it became illegal.
And could you trace for us the course of use and study of phencyclidine at a time when its use in humans was legal?
Yes, well, in the 50s, when it was used in anesthesia, it was found that many, if not most, individuals who had completed their surgery and were emerging from surgery, waking up after their operation, had bad reactions. They had delirium and hallucinations and things that looked like psychosis. There were then also some studies done in the late 50s and early 60s on both normal volunteers and patients with schizophrenia or psychosis, and it was found that the observations made in the surgical patients also held in many of the normal volunteers, that they had adverse reactions to phencyclidine that looked like psychosis or schizophrenia. When the drug was given to patients who already had schizophrenia, they got much worse. So as a result of that, the drug was then removed from the market in the mid-60s.
And since the mid-60s, what has its status been from a clinical standpoint?
Well, it's not allowed to be used in a legal sense for prescription to patients. It's become a substance of abuse. There may have been in the late 60s some very carefully controlled studies sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, but once you got into the 70s, there was no more clinical investigation with PCP.
And since that time, has it been used in other sorts of clinical studies, on animals, for instance?
It's been used in animal studies. And its effects on the chemistry of the brain have been studied in brains of animals and in pieces removed from human brain at autopsy, but it's not been used in clinical studies.
Now, has, in your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what causes these sorts of behaviors from the ingestion of PCP?
Well, it's known that the drug interacts with receptor sites or recognition points in the brain that are involved in the disease of schizophrenia. One of these is the so-called NMDA receptor. That's one receptor system. The other one is what's called the dopamine system. These are receptors which mediate some of the effects of schizophrenia. So the effects of this drug on the brain are consistent with what it's doing when it's administered to people or when people take it as a drug of abuse.
And what are the symptoms that you're referring to when you talk about the psychosis or schizophrenia-like symptoms?
Right, well, when the drug produces these kinds of symptoms or syndromes in humans, there can be what we call negative symptoms in which people take on a trance-like state. They have difficulty in cognition and memory, and in so-called executive functioning, thinking, etc. But they can also have what we call positive symptoms. That means things like hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that aren't there, delusions. They can feel disconnected from their body. They feel that they feel no pain. And there can also be episodes of unpredictably occurring harm to others or harm to themselves.
And what is the mechanism that leads to that behavior from the use of PCP?
Yes, it's what we discussed with respect to its interaction on those receptors. So that is thought to be the mechanism of how these effects happen.
And what is the name of the receptor that you referred to?
There are two of them. The principal one is so-called NMDA receptor, and the second one is the dopamine receptor. And these are, again, recognition sites in the brain which mediate certain actions in humans.
Now, are there any physical manifestations of a person under the influence of PCP?
Yes, there can be many manifestations. Some of them can be what I talked about, like the trance-like state where people don't seem to be connected with themselves or with the environment. There can be some elevations in blood pressure. There can be sweating, tremulousness, shaking. And there may be people apparently reacting to hearing voices, etc.
And are there any physical manifestations that are observable to people that may be in their company?
There may be, but not necessarily. I mean, you may see agitation and tremulousness and sweating, etc., or you may see nothing. They may appear normal.
Now, are there studies about the duration of the effects of ingesting PCP?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, initially it was observed that the effects were confined to the period after ingestion. But then on further observation, it was clear that the effects of the drug can be sustained for much longer periods of time, certainly 1 to 2 days after exposure, and in some cases, effects of psychosis can persist long after that for weeks or even months. So the effect is not confined to the immediate period of exposure.
And are there any studies that document the effect of regular or chronic ingestion of PCP?
Yes.
What are those?
Well, in the largest compiled set of data is a study published by the National Institute of Drug Abuse in 1978, and that puts together the experience from many sources on both acute and chronic exposure to PCP, what the dangers are, how you treat it, etc.
And do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, as to whether PCP ingestion can cause violent behavior?
Yes, I do.
What is that
I
opinion?
think it can cause violent behavior.
And what's the basis for that?
The basis is the combined experience from many sources on numerous individuals that have been treated or seen for abuse of PCP and the occurrence of violent behavior both to others and to themselves in those patients, together with what we know are the effects of the drug on the brain in a chemical sense.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to whether such behavior can be unpredictable?
Yes, I do. It can be unpredictable.
And why is that?
That's just the nature of the disorder. It can be, people can appear normal sometimes and be aggressive and violent at other times, and you can't tell when the switch will happen or how often it will happen or to whom it will happen.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to how well established is the causal connection between PCP use and episodes of violent behavior?
Yes, I feel that there is an established causal connection.
That's your opinion?
That's my opinion. I don't.
And what's the basis for that opinion?
Again, what I've put together from looking at the experience in a large number of individuals who have ingested PCP, which has been reported in the scientific literature, and also what is known about what the drug does to the brain.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Of course, there's a large body of literature, is there not, Doctor, that suggests that that's not true?
No, that's not the case.
That's not the case. Are you familiar with articles and books that make that point?
The point has been made, yes.
Okay, and it's just your opinion, you don't agree with it?
My opinion is that the preponderance of the evidence leads to the conclusion that I gave.
Well, you don't agree.
I didn't say that.
Prior to being contacted in the fall of 2014, as you've indicated, exactly how many articles had you written on the effects of PCP, Doctor?
I don't know that I've written specifically on PCP, though you'll find some articles on treating drug abuse due to hallucinogens or bad trips or whatever.
I'm sorry?
Just what I said.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
Okay, maybe you could also repeat the question.
I said exactly how many articles had you written on PCP prior to being contacted in the fall of 2014 by defense counsel?
Yes, and the answer is I haven't specifically written an article on PCP, though I have written articles on the general topic of treating drug abuse in the emergency room.
And did any of those include clinical observations of people with PCP intoxication?
I don't recall.
No, correct?
I don't recall.
The answer is actually no, isn't that true, Doctor?
The answer is I don't recall.
Okay. Could you tell me the article that you wrote that included clinical observations of treating a patient with PCP intoxication, please?
Well, you will find, I believe, in the 70s an article in the American Journal of Psychiatry called Drug Abuse in the Emergency Room Physician. I don't recall if that dealt with PCP or not, as I previously
We've had plenty of
testified.
opportunity to go back and review that article.
No, I
correct?
didn't review that article.
Okay. Now, you'd agree with me, would you not, Doctor, that the presence of PCP is not a necessary element for an incident of violence, true?
Correct.
And that the presence of PCP alone is not a precondition for an incident of violence. Isn't that true?
By that, do you mean can people commit violence without PCP?
No, what I'm suggesting, my question is, the fact that you have PCP alone does not indicate that a violent event will occur. Isn't that true, Doctor?
I'm trying to understand your question. Do you mean that people can commit violence without PCP?
No.
Yes.
What I'm suggesting in my question, Doctor, is the fact that a person is has PCP in their system, that alone does not indicate that there will be an incident of violence. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that you asked before. Yes, I agree with that.
So, as you've told us, you can't predict an act of violence from the presence, whatever it is, of PCP.
Yes, that's correct.
And in order to try to conclude that an act of violence occurred related to PCP, you'd have to know with some certainty whether or not there was PCP present, true?
Yes.
whether or not there were other drugs being used, true?
Well, I'm not sure. In any given case, I'm not sure you can ever precisely predict what the outcome will be or what the role of PCP was.
Right, you'd actually have no idea whether or not PCP was related to an incident of violence unless you knew all of the other factors. Isn't that true?
Whether or not you knew the other factors. In any given case, you don't know.
Well, you don't know.
That's
And
right.
so, in fact, there are other drugs that are associated with incidents of violence, correct?
Other drugs in general, yes.
And alcohol is associated with incidents of violence, true?
Sometimes, yes.
And in fact, isn't it true that alcohol is actually the #1 intoxicant that is associated with incidents of violence?
That I don't know.
And that's because, in particular, alcohol reduces inhibitions to violence. Isn't that true?
It's known that alcohol reduces inhibitions, yes. The relation to violence, not entirely clear.
Given the fact that you had no prior publishing in the area of PCP, could you tell us, please, Doctor, why it was indicated to you that you were asked to consider this question of PCP and violence?
Well, I've been doing psychopharmacology for 45 years, and substance abuse is one of the things that I teach and have done research on. But why I was actually asked, I can't
That was never
answer the
indicated
question.
to you.
Pardon me?
That was never indicated to
What
you.
was never indicated?
Why you were being asked to provide testimony in regards to PCP and violence?
Not in so many words, no.
Well, in how many words was it
There was
indicated to you?
not in so many words. I was asked to testify, and my presumption is, although you'd have to ask the attorneys, is that I have been doing psychopharmacology for many decades.
Okay, and how many cases in psychopharmacology dealing with PCP have you done work prior to fall of 2014?
Well, when I was training in the inner city Boston hospitals and in the Bronx, there were cases of PCP abuse that I saw. But I have not specifically done research on PCP,
And when was that, please?
the early 70s.
And so it's fair to say that you've had no clinical exposure to PCP, assuming that you had some back in the 70s, correct?
I have not treated patients with PCP abuse, correct?
And, well, PCP intoxication?
Any known relationship to PCP, I haven't dealt with that in a clinical sense since the early 70s.
And so when you now testify here today, that's on the basis of performing research after you were engaged by the defendant, is that
No,
correct?
no.
Now, you'd agree with me then, Doctor, that in order to, well, let me ask you this question. What else did you review besides the literature prior to your testimony here?
Well, as I've told you before, I teach psychopharmacology and have done so for many decades, and as part of what I do in my occupation, I have to know about drugs of abuse and their effects, and that includes PCP.
Okay. Did you review any factual circumstances related to this case?
No.
None. Would you recognize PCP intoxication, Doctor, if you saw it?
I expect I would.
Okay. Now, you'd agree with me, would you not, Doctor, that as you've indicated, that this sudden state of violence persists for some period of time?
It might or it might not.
Okay? And when you say it might not, what do you mean by that?
It might or might not persist for a period of time.
Okay, and how long a period of time would a sudden state of violence persist for, if you know?
It's unpredictable.
And it's unpredictable because you don't know, and therefore it's unpredictable to you, or it's unascertainable?
All I can say is it's unpredictable.
Meaning you don't know.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, well, tell us, to the extent that you know, Doctor, how long does this sudden state of violence persist for?
It's unpredictable. It may be short, it may be long, you can't predict.
Okay, when you say long, what do you mean by that?
extended period of time. I don't have a specific number in mind.
Okay, days?
I don't know.
Okay, well, it's in the literature, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Okay,
It's
have you
uncertain.
found it in the literature, doctor?
What was your, I'm sorry, you're
Have
going
you
kind of...
found in the
Wait a sec
literature?
now, could you just ask the question and then let me answer, please?
Well, I asked you a question.
Well, go ahead and ask,
Okay,
please.
have you found in the literature the length of this state of violence and how long it persists?
Yes, and it's unpredictable.
Okay. Is it days, doctor?
It could be, but I'm not sure.
And when you say you're not sure, it's not because it's not in the literature, you don't recall, is that correct?
No, it's because it's unpredictable.
And would you agree with me, it's more than minutes?
It may be minutes, could be minutes,
Okay.
could be short, could be long.
And describe these sudden states of violence as you know them, please.
I have not seen it, so I can't provide any witness to that effect.
Well, in your review of the literature, describe them for us, please.
People are said to have unpredictable, intermittent episodes of violent behavior, where they
Well, when you-
injure themselves or they injure others, or maybe they're just violent. It's unpredictable.
And you'd agree with me that, as you've described all of these potential behavioral manifestations of PCP, that is sort of the most rare of all of them, isn't that true?
No, I don't think so.
You don't agree with that?
No.
You wouldn't agree that the negative manifestations of psychosis is actually more common?
I can't say that that's true,
And you can't say that that's true because you don't know?
because I'm not sure it's known.
You'd agree with me, in fact, that part of the issue in discussing PCP and its relationship to violence is that because it is an illicit drug, it's not possible to study in human beings, true?
At the present, it's not possible to do a controlled trial in which the drug is deliberately administered to humans.
Right. But there has been research done since this NIDA study in the 1970s, as you've described it, isn't that correct?
To my knowledge, not in humans.
Well, based on information collected in emergency rooms and in police departments around the country,
There is experience with PCP as a drug of abuse, yes.
and you'd agree with me that that research is based in large part on not just, well, strike that question. If I could, Your Honor, could I go to Exhibit 150, please? Camera 3, 230 and more. Actually, I ask you to take a look at your monitor on your left there, Doc. Now, doctor, have you ever seen this video before?
No,
Do you know who's depicted in that video?
no.
Okay. Do you know how long after the violent episode this video was taken?
No,
Okay. Do you see any evidence of PCP intoxication in that video?
I can't tell.
You can't tell?
Right.
And when you say you can't tell, why is that, doctor?
Because there's not enough information.
Okay. Do you see any signs of intoxication in that video?
I can't tell if there is or isn't.
You're just unwilling to express an opinion?
I didn't say that. I said I can't tell if there is or isn't.
What more information do you need, doctor?
A lot more information.
You need more information than that?
Yes.
Okay. And I'd ask you to take a look at the monitor on your left there, doctor. Now, having looked at that, have you ever seen that video before?
No.
See any evidence of PCP intoxication there?
I can't tell.
Do you see any evidence of PCP-induced psychosis there?
I can't tell.
You could tell, could you not, doctor, that there's no evidence of the positive aspects of psychosis in that video?
I cannot tell from that video.
Describe for us, please, then, doctor, what the positive aspects of psychosis are.
They include things like hallucinations, delusions, feeling disconnected from oneself, feelings of hostility or being persecuted, maybe violent or unpredictable behavior, talking to people that aren't there, etc.
Okay. So there are some that are sort of internal, correct? That may not have behavioral manifestations, as you describe them, true?
There are things that are observable and things that are not necessarily observable.
Okay, so let's focus on the observable ones, doctor. Do you see any evidence of the positive, observable indications of psychosis in that particular video?
There's not enough information for me to tell one way or the other.
One of the characteristics of somebody in deep throes of the positive aspects of psychosis is they are purposeless in their conduct, isn't that correct?
That is one possibility, yes.
They are disorganized in their conduct, is that correct?
That is one possibility.
That their movement is uncontrolled,
That is a possibility, yes.
okay? And those types of things you would expect to see associated with psychosis related to violence, isn't that true, Doctor?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so you wouldn't, you would expect then to see somebody who's psychotic, unobservable, and yet somehow acting out in an extremely violent manner.
That I didn't say, but the point is that the aggressive, violent behavior is unpredictable.
Okay. Did you see any aggressive or violent behavior in that video?
I can't really tell what their behavior was. I only saw people walking from the car.
Okay. Well, let me ask, well, that's fine. Nothing further. Thank you, Doc. Nothing
You may
further.
step down.
Thank you.
Right this way, please.
Ms. Maverick, I hear you on your motion to eliminate, to exclude.
Your Honor, essentially what the defendant is suggesting to the court is that through Dr. Greenblatt, the defendant is entitled to put in essentially propensity evidence because it is evidence of character, bad character. I think that is, I think, unquestionable, Your Honor. What he's suggesting is that a class of people, i.e. PCP users, have manifestations of bad character, i.e. violence. And that is nothing more than propensity evidence in our law, Your Honor. The defendant, as we know, is subject to the same restraints as the Commonwealth is on the introduction of bad character evidence, is that it is not admissible to show that somebody acted in conformance with their bad character. And that's exactly what the defendant is attempting to do in the use of Dr. Greenblatt's testimony. And what the defendant suggests is he's entitled to do that because it's third-party culprit evidence. But the suggestion that it is third-party culprit evidence doesn't answer the question, Your Honor. That there are a number of cases. There's a fairly recent case, Commonwealth versus Smith, that really follows the whole line of and reaffirms the whole line of third-party culprit cases in the Commonwealth. You can't adduce evidence that is speculative. And the doctor's testimony here, Your Honor, shows exactly the speculative nature of the proffered evidence. That is, there is no basis. He has no opinion. He has an opinion about PCP, but that it can be related to violence, but he has no, and there are no facts that are relevant here. We have video minutes after the violent episode, and the doctor can't say one way or the other. Either he can't or he's unwilling, one of the two. He can't say that there's any manifestation of psychosis at all, and I think it defies logic to suggest that there's a switch, and it's not consistent with his testimony. In fact, what his testimony is that it can't be predicted. PCP is neither a necessary predicate or its presence a necessary end state that violence will occur. Alcohol, there are a million other things. So just because the defendant suggests that there's scant evidence of PCP here, that he's entitled to put in that a person used PCP and therefore acted violently, I'm suggesting to the court that's pure speculation. It is in violation of the prohibition against bad character evidence. It does not conform to third-party culprit evidence. It is prejudicial. Its probative value is de minimis, Your Honor, and I'm suggesting even in balancing, even if the court was inclined to consider it under that rubric, that on balance, the prejudicial effect versus the probative value, it should be excluded.
Your Honor, we laid out in...
I object. Mr. Rankin is the proponent of the evidence.
One of them gets to argue, but I don't care which one. As long as we don't have more than two people arguing, as long as Mr. Rankin isn't going to follow you up with additional argument, it doesn't matter which one.
Thank you, Your Honor. It'll just be me. Thank you.
Okay.
Your Honor, we filed late last week a memorandum which I think sets forth really the two distinct bodies of law that I think are implicated by Dr. Greenblatt's testimony. The first was alluded to, they've actually both been alluded to by the prosecutor. The first is third-party culprit evidence. And it's well settled that the defendant has a right to present a complete defense as a constitutional right. And the opportunity to present third-party culprit evidence is of constitutional dimension. And as the SJC said in the seminal Silva-Santiago case, if the evidence is of substantial probative value and will not tend to prejudice or confuse, all doubt should be resolved in favor of admissibility. And that's because it is of constitutional dimension and essentially precluding a defendant from presenting a defense before the jury obviously undercuts his constitutional right to present a defense. The second body of law, which is relevant here, Your Honor, is that there are times, I think this is one of them, where the admissibility of expert testimony, for example, depends upon a predicate or conditional fact. If there were not evidence in this case which would permit a reasonable jury to infer by a preponderance of the evidence that individuals, namely Ortiz and Wallace, were on PCP on the night in question, then Dr. Greenblatt's testimony would not be relevant and it would not be admissible. But, Your Honor, based on the testimony of Jennifer Mercado, and I should point out, Your Honor, it was the Commonwealth that elicited initially her testimony about PCP, not the defense. And it was the Commonwealth who not only elicited her testimony about that evening, but showed her a video of Ortiz and Wallace arriving at Hernandez's home around midnight, and her testimony about that video, her testimony about personally observing Ortiz and Wallace on PCP and the and how and behavior, Wallace's behavior while on PCP, her personal observations about their sweatiness and jitteriness when they were on PCP, and what she observed that night when they left Connecticut. That is more than enough, Your Honor, to meet the standard that's required for a conditional fact. And, you know, Mr. Bomberg says it's scant evidence. Well, that's for the jury to determine. And as the court, the SJC said in Bright, which I think is an extremely instructive case on this whole area, what the SJC said in Bright is that, find it, Your Honor. A jury would naturally disregard evidence they found not to be relevant to the case based on the determination of a predicate fact, which is why, again, why any doubt should be resolved in favor of admissibility. In other words, if the jury doesn't buy what Jennifer Mercado said, and they think she's all wet, then they're not going to pay any attention to Dr. Greenblatt either. So we have done enough to establish the predicate fact. It's in the case. It's up to the jury to decide whether or not to believe that predicate fact. And if they do find that predicate fact by preponderance of the evidence, clearly Dr. Greenblatt's testimony is highly relevant. Your Honor, this is not propensity evidence. This is scientific evidence about the effects of this particular drug. And we're not talking about PCP use in general. We're talking about the early morning of June 17th, 2013. It is up to the jury to decide what weight, if any, to give to Dr. Greenblatt's testimony. But, Your Honor, it's not even close with respect to the balance, and it would be a violation of Mr. Hernandez's constitutional rights to preclude this testimony, and I ask the court to allow it.
To the extent that the Commonwealth raised this issue, that was in redirect examination, Your Honor, and in fact, Dr. Greenblatt's testimony is general. He has no specific relationship of PCP to this particular night, and that's what it is. It's generalized testimony that has no relationship to any fact.
I'm not sure it's relevant, and I certainly don't believe it's controlling as to who raised it, but the transcript that was supplied shows that the issue of drugs and PCP in particular was on direct, pages 16 to 22 before the cross. The admission of expert testimony rests in the broad discretion of the court. The test for relevance is whether the proffered testimony will assist the trier of fact in understanding the evidence or determining a factual issue in this case. Clearly, expert testimony that doesn't relate to any issue in the case is not relevant and, as a matter of law, not helpful expert testimony. The court recognizes that expert testimony should not be admitted unless the subject of the testimony is one on which the jurors would need assistance. It's not a matter of common knowledge and can be helped by that testimony. I do not find any support for the proposition that this type of evidence is propensity evidence. No case suggesting that or holding that has been brought to the court's attention. There are numerous cases all across the country where this type of evidence has been allowed. There's a California case where a psychiatrist testified that the effects of PCP are widely variable and unpredictable, and that it's common for people under the influence of PCP to have impaired judgment. There's another California case where a psychopharmacologist testified that PCP causes a user to respond from the limbic system, which causes a person to act like an animal and to respond combatively, assaultively, aggressively, and violently without thinking and without using the higher cortical centers where rules of conduct and, is considered. There is New York case where in reducing a verdict to manslaughter, the court noted that a doctor had testified as a defense expert that PCP may make someone violent. The context there was whether the victim may have been violent. There is a DC case where, in support of a motion for new trial, a recognized pharmacology expert testified that the effects of PCP can last 2 to 3 days, and PCP can cause aggressive and combative behavior, and the court found trial counsel ineffective for failing to consult with such an expert about the possible effects of PCP on the victim's ability on the effects of PCP because the average juror would not understand the general effects of PCP without assistance. There's another DC case where the defendant had attempted to have a forensic pharmacologist testify that PCP impairs the ability to perceive reality, and on appeal it was deemed error to have excluded testimony of experts simply because they could not testify as to the actual effects of PCP on the specific person involved in that case. They were going to testify, as in this case, on general impact. The court noted that observations of the individual who allegedly used drugs is not a prerequisite for expert testimony, and that the proposed testimony would have assisted the jury in evaluating the victim's credibility in her account of the assault. There is a Michigan case where a psychiatrist testified that PCP can affect the ability to control violent impulses, the kind of testimony that the defense is seeking to have here. General testimony on the effects of PCP has been accepted throughout and in many, many, many courts in the United States. There's been no suggestion in any of those cases that presenting such testimony falls within the parameters of propensity evidence, and the court finds that it does not. Further find the testimony is relevant because the predicate has been shown by preponderance of the evidence. I do not find that it is more prejudicial than probative. To the extent that the Commonwealth made other arguments in its memo of law, such as that the defendant should not be allowed to introduce circumstantial evidence, should not be allowed to ask the jury to draw inferences because the defendant has the opportunity to take the stand and testify as to what happened. The court rejects that argument in its entirety. The defendant has not sought to ask, and certainly would not be allowed to ask, whether this witness has an opinion as to whether someone other than the defendant murdered Mr. Lloyd, or is not going to be asked whether this witness has an opinion, giving a hypothetical of what Ms. Mercado testified to, whether this witness has an opinion that given that either Mr. Wallace or Mr. Ortiz engaged in a sudden act of violence. The motion in limine to exclude the testimony is denied. The court officers wanted a sense as to what time you think we're going to finish up today, just in terms of the logistics that they arranged.
Your Honor, we have 3 witnesses to call. I want to make sure the third one is here, but I think he will be. Dr. Greenblatt, Mr. Carita, who swabbed the bubble gum, and Ms. Smith from Selmark in Texas, who tested the bubble gum. I have no idea how long the Commonwealth will be on cross, but I think that we should be done by lunchtime, would be my
That was really
prediction.
the issue, is whether we should order lunches, but we'll have a better sense at 11 o'clock.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Let's bring the jurors down.
He. All persons having anything to do before the Honorable, the Justice E. Susan Gosh of the Superior Court, now sitting at Fall River within and for the Commonwealth. Draw near, give your attendance, and you shall be heard. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Court is now in session. Be seated, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Today is Monday, April 6, 2015. The case on trial is Commonwealth versus Aaron Hernandez, indictment BRCR 2013-0983. The Honorable E. Susan Gosh presiding.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Hope you all had a good long weekend. Let me ask you, did any of you discuss this case in any way, shape, or form with anybody at all since I last inquired? There are no affirmative responses. And have any of you seen or heard or read or overheard anything at all about this case or Mr. Hernandez? There are no affirmative responses. And have any of you done any research about this case or anything you think could be relevant to the case? There are no affirmative responses. And have any of you had any difficulty following any of my instructions about not talking about the case, avoiding anything about the case, or Mr. Hernandez not doing any research about the case, any of my instructions at all? There are no affirmative responses. You may call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Greenblatt, please.
This way, sir. Please face the clerk and raise your right hand.
Sir, do solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this court and this jury will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Greenblatt.
Morning.
Try to keep your voice up so everyone can hear.
Yes.
Could you tell us what your name is, please?
David J. Greenblatt.
How do you spell your last name?
Greenblatt.
Can you tell us how old you are?
69.
And where do you live?
Newton, Massachusetts.
And where do you work?
Tufts University School of Medicine in downtown Boston, and also Tufts Medical Center.
And among other things, are you a medical doctor?
Yes.
Could you tell us about your education, beginning with college and going through your medical training?
Yes, so Amherst College, 1966. Harvard Medical School, 1970. Then I was an intern in the Bronx at Montefiore Hospital, which is in Albert Einstein College of Medicine, from 70 to 71. Then from 71 to 72, I was a medical resident at what used to be Boston City Hospital, which is now Boston Medical Center. And then from 72 to 74, I did fellowship training in the field of clinical pharmacology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Then from 74 to 79, I was on the faculty and staff and division chief of the clinical pharmacology unit at Massachusetts General Hospital. And then in 1979, moved to Tufts Medical School, where I, over the years, established a research program and also teach medical students and graduate students and do administrative work. So I'm now professor at Tufts University School of Medicine.
You mentioned that your field is clinical pharmacology, or
Yes.
it was at some point.
That it is.
Could you tell the jury, please, what is clinical pharmacology?
Yes, that's the discipline in which the effects of drugs in humans are looked at, what their mechanisms of action are, how they're supposed to be used clinically and therapeutically to treat disease, and what their adverse effects are.
And can you tell the jury for how long you've been studying, teaching, and researching in the field of pharmacology?
Well, since the early 70s, so at
Up
least.
until now?
Yes.
Now, could you tell us what your present positions are at the Tufts University School of Medicine?
Yes, well, I'm professor of pharmacology and experimental therapeutics. I also hold professorships in psychiatry, medicine, and anesthesia. And I run a research program in psychopharmacology and other aspects of pharmacology at Tufts. I do teaching of medical students and graduate students at Tufts University, and I also do administration. In the past, I've served as the chairperson of the Institutional Review Board, which reviews human research. And I've also served as the department chairman of the Department of Pharmacology.
Dr. Greenblatt, you just used the phrase psychopharmacology. What is psychopharmacology as opposed to pharmacology?
It's kind of a subunit of clinical pharmacology dealing with the effects of drugs used to treat mental disorders, drugs of abuse, drugs that act on the brain and the nervous system.
And Dr. Greenblatt, are you certified by any boards in any specialty field?
Yes, I'm certified by the American Board of Clinical Pharmacology.
And what does that entail?
It entails taking an exam, knowing the subject matter.
And when did you become board certified?
I believe 1991.
Now, have you received any awards or honors in your profession?
Yes.
Object.
Have you received any awards or honors in your profession?
Yes.
Could you tell us about those, please?
In 1980, I received what's called the Rawls-Palmer Award from the American Society of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, which is an award for excellence in research. In 2005, I received an award for clinical research from the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences. In just this year, I received a Distinguished Faculty Award from Tufts University, which is awarded to people for excellence in research and teaching. There may be others.
Are you on the editorial board of any publications in your field?
Yes, I'm editor-in-chief of a journal called Clinical Pharmacology and Drug Development. I am co-editor-in-chief with Dr. Richard Shader of a journal called the Journal of Clinical Psychopharmacology, and I also am on the editorial board of a number of other journals.
And have you authored any research articles?
Yes.
And when I say research articles, could you describe what that means?
Well, research articles would be describing the results of original new research that was done by myself or my colleagues.
And are you familiar with the term peer-reviewed?
Yes.
And is that P-E-E-R?
Yes.
And what does peer-reviewed mean in your field?
It means that when you complete a scientific manuscript or paper based on research or whatever, and you submit it to a journal for publication, the journal will send the article out to experts for review. And they call it peer review because there's supposed to be people like us, and they anonymously review the paper and decide whether it's acceptable or not acceptable for publication, or most often they come back with things that they think need to be changed or revised before it can be published.
And over the course of your career, how many peer-reviewed articles have you authored or co-authored?
In the original research field, in the range of 760.
760 distinct articles.
Yes.
And have you authored chapters in any books that are in your field?
Yes.
Can you tell us how many times you've authored chapters in books?
I believe the number is over 100.
And have you authored any comments or editorials in journals in your field?
Yes.
And can you tell us how many times you've done that?
That would be in the range of 80 or so.
And how about any books? Have you authored or co-authored any books in your field?
Yes.
How many?
8 or 9, I think.
Now, do you have a document that gives the details of each and every one of these awards, articles, chapters, and books?
Yes.
I object.
I'm going to offer it after Dr. Greenblatt.
I object.
Yes.
Is that a copy of your curriculum vitae?
Yes.
And does that summarize the, or give the details of the awards, articles, chapters, and books that you've authored, that you summarized just a moment ago?
Yes.
Your Honor, to offer it.
I object.
The objection sustained. You may, if he needs it to refresh his recollection, leave the document with the witness, and you may go through everything on the CV if you wish.
So, Dr. Greenblatt, using your CV, could you tell us that if in fact you've received some 20 awards over the course of your career? I'm sorry.
Yes,
14 awards?
Yes, that's
Does that
correct.
appear to be right?
Yes.
And these are all in the field of clinical pharmacology or psychopharmacology?
Yes.
And is it the case that you're on the editorial boards of 10 different publications in your field?
Yes, that's correct.
And these all concern pharmacology or psychopharmacology?
Yes.
And is it the case that you are a member of 8 professional societies?
Yes.
Now, you said that you've authored or co-authored in excess of 700 articles in peer-reviewed publications?
Yes.
Is it the case that you've authored or co-authored 762 of those articles?
Yes.
And can you tell us kind of the range of those research articles?
Well, they range from studies done in humans on the effect of psychiatric drugs on the behavior of people and how that may vary in relation to factors like age, gender, male or female, body habitus, whether somebody is thin or not thin or overweight, interactions of drugs, what happens when you give 2 drugs at the same time, how does that influence the effect of the drug. There are also studies done in a more basic science level, molecular studies of enzymes responsible for drug metabolism, and also studies of brain chemistry and the binding of certain drugs to receptors or recognition sites in brain. There are also studies, what we would call epidemiology, but studies of what happens when drugs are given to large numbers of people and the overall effects of these drugs in populations. Finally, there are studies on genetics and how the composition of genes and DNA can influence drug response and metabolism.
Now, does your CV also set out the chapters in books that you've authored?
Yes.
And does that include 166 chapters or reviews in that area?
Yes.
And do those chapters and reviews generally concern the same subject matter that you just described in your peer review articles?
Yes.
And with respect to editorials, comments in journals in your field, is it the case that you've authored 82 of those?
Yes.
And with respect to books that you've authored or co-authored, have you in fact authored or co-authored 12 books?
Yes.
And again, the same general subject matter?
Yes.
And when you say drugs as a field of your work, are you talking both about legal drugs that can be prescribed and illicit drugs that are drugs of abuse?
Yes.
Now, you described your work as a professor at the Tufts University School of Medicine. Could you tell us what your teaching responsibilities have been over the years in terms of teaching medical students?
Yes. So over the years, I have been director of the course in pharmacology that is taught to medical students in the first or second year. That is the basics of pharmacology and what drugs do and what their mechanisms are. I also teach to medical students a course for seniors who are about to graduate and go into internship, and that we call clinical pharmacology, how to be an intern. So we try to teach them how you actually use drugs in humans so they can be prepared for what they face when they start in a hospital on July 1st. So that's medical students. We also teach graduate students who are looking for a PhD in pharmacology, a scientific degree, so they can ultimately be scientists. So there we're teaching there's a clinical component to it, but also more of a molecular component, or what the enzymes do and what the receptors do. So it's a mixture of graduate and medical school teaching. I also teach postgraduate pharmacology to people who are residents training physicians in the hospital, and also to some national organizations as well.
Now, Dr. Greenblatt, were you retained by the defense to assist in this case in the fall of 2014?
Yes.
And what request did the defense make for you?
They asked me to formulate an opinion about the effects of PCP, or phencyclidine, in humans.
And what word did you use? Phencyclidine?
Yes.
Could you spell that for us, please?
PHENCYCLIDINE.
And is that the scientific term for PCP?
Yes, it is.
And does PCP have a street name that's familiar to you?
Yes, the one I know is angel dust, but there's a bunch of different street names.
Okay. And how did you go about doing your work in preparing to appear here?
I object. Could I be seen at the sidebar?
So, Dr. Greenblatt, what did you do to begin this engagement?
With respect to PCP?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Dr. Greenblatt.
Well, I had experience with understanding and teaching about substance abuse as part of what I normally do, because I have been teaching that for long before this case. In particular, for this case, I went to the peer-reviewed scientific literature and went through a number of sources to try to determine what is the state of knowledge prevailing in the scientific community about PCP and what its effects are.
Now, was there a time when PCP was a lawfully prescribed drug in the United States?
Yes, so going back to the 1950s and early 1960s, it was actually a legal drug used in anesthesia with surgery. It was thought to be a drug that reduced pain, so it was given along with other, like general anesthetics in the course of surgery. So that persisted until the mid-1960s.
And was there a body of scientific knowledge built up over those years with respect to the effects of PCP on human beings?
Yes.
And could you describe the evolution of that knowledge between the 1950s, when it became legal, and the mid-1960s, when it was no longer legal?
Right. Well, what was first observed when the drug was used in anesthesia was that when people were waking up from anesthesia, they were having very bad reactions. They were having hallucinations, delusions, agitated behavior, disconnection, feeling disconnected from their surroundings. Many of the effects that we know are related to schizophrenia or psychosis subjects or patients who are undergoing surgery were having when they were waking up. It was also observed in actual laboratory studies that when PCP was administered to humans under controlled conditions, it produced effects and thoughts and outcomes that looked very much like schizophrenia, so that people were having dissociation and feelings of disconnection and hallucinations and other adverse effects which looked very much like schizophrenia. So as a result of that, the drug was removed from the market in 1965.
Now, you used the term schizophrenia. Could you explain to the jury what schizophrenia is?
Right, well, that's a mental illness in itself, which happens to a number of people, and we don't really know why it happens, but it can be very severe, and there are different kinds of symptoms. Some are related to what we call negative symptoms, where people are withdrawn and don't engage with their surroundings or with their family or their friends. They may have difficulty with thought and memory, difficulty holding on to information and processing it, and difficulty separating what's real from what's not real. Then there are also positive symptoms in which people have active hallucinations where they feel that people are talking to them, or they feel that they're being persecuted, somebody is after them, so-called paranoia. And occasionally they can, erupt into behavior that's harmful to themselves or others.
So those are the symptoms that manifest themselves when a person has schizophrenia.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the observations of the pharmacological community with respect to the use of PCP in the 1950s and 1960s, did those observations track the symptoms that had previously been observed in schizophrenics?
Yes, in fact, PCP was said to be a drug that is a model for schizophrenia. It produces something which is largely not distinguishable from schizophrenia.
And are you familiar with the term PCP psychosis?
Yes.
What is PCP psychosis?
Yes, that's what I was talking about, these reactions that people had when they were coming out of anesthesia, or when normal volunteers were given PCP in the laboratory in the early 60s, or as time went on, as experience was gathered with PCP abuse, as cases began to mount up, many of the people who were exposed to PCP developed this syndrome, which looks just like schizophrenia.
The PCP psychosis looks like schizophrenia?
Yes.
Now, once PCP was banned as a lawful drug in the mid-1960s, were further research studies done on humans using PCP?
Well, with maybe a couple of exceptions. Of course, it's because the drug has hazards, it wasn't possible to do research, controlled research on the drug where it was deliberately given to humans. So that largely stopped. But so the experience with it after the time it was banned would be based on abuse of PCP as a drug of abuse.
And in the years since it was banned as a lawful drug in 1965, have there been uses of PCP, legitimate or authorized uses of PCP in other sorts of studies?
Yes, it can't be given to humans, but it is used in experimental research, mostly as a model to look at what happens to the brain when there's schizophrenia. So it's still used in research in animal settings, but it's not given to humans.
And so since 1965, there haven't been controlled experiments with PCP on any significant scale?
Not to my knowledge, no.
And has there developed a body of knowledge in the pharmacological community about the effects of PCP since that time?
Objection. As I indicated previously.
Without going into the substance of
Overall.
it. Has there developed a body of...
Yes, I mean, over the years, we've started to learn.
The question was just, has there developed a body of
Yes.
knowledge?
I'm not trying to elicit the substance of what the scientific community has learned, okay?
Yes.
It is part of the way that scientists learn more about a certain area to gather information like this.
Yes.
All right. Now, with respect to the studies that were done between the late 1950s and 1965, were there studies that analyzed how frequently this sort of behavior would occur?
I object.
Sustained.
With respect, without going into the substance of it, of the answer, were there studies that looked at how prevalent this condition was?
I object.
Sustained.
Now, could you tell us, Doctor, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? What causes PCP psychosis?
Yes, I have an opinion.
All right. What's that opinion?
Well, over the years, it's been learned that PCP.
I object.
Sustained.
What is your opinion?
Just what's your opinion, not what you've learned from others.
Could you restate what the original question
Yes.
was? You asked?
Do you have an opinion about whether there's a causal relationship between PCP psychosis and the ingestion of PCP?
Yes.
And what's that opinion?
My opinion is that PCP ingestion can cause psychosis.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to what are the manifestations of this psychosis?
Yes.
What are the range of manifestations of this psychosis?
They are much the same as we talked about with schizophrenia. There can be negative symptoms that would be things like feeling disconnected, being in a trance state, having difficulty processing information, having difficulty telling what's real and not real, difficulty with cognition, that is solving problems, etc. Then we go to the more positive symptoms with active hallucinations, either hearing things or seeing things that are not there, or feelings of persecution, paranoid type problems, and on some occasions violent or aggressive behavior that can appear sometimes or unpredictably, and that might include behavior that could be harmful to themselves or to others.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty about the mechanism of how this psychosis arises?
Yes.
And what is that?
My opinion is that the known effects of PCP on the brain, that's the knowledge that's been developed over the decades, is that there are certain receptors or recognition sites in the brain that the drug attaches to and produces its effect by those attachment to so-called receptor sites. And the two principal receptor sites are one, it's called the NMDA receptor, which is thought to mediate the negative symptoms, and PCP attaches to that receptor and blocks it. Then the positive effects of schizophrenia are thought to be connected to another receptor called the dopamine receptor. Dopamine is a chemical in the brain that transmits impulses, and too much dopamine is bad because it produces schizophrenia and positive symptoms, and PCP also attaches to that receptor and stimulates it. So the effects of PCP psychosis that we see in people are consistent with what we know the effects on the brain to be.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to how long the symptoms can endure after the ingestion of PCP?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
The opinion is that it can vary from only a few hours after exposure to effects that can persist for hours or days or even weeks or months after ingestion. So the effects are not necessarily confined to the period of immediate when you last took it. They can last much longer than that.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to how quickly the manifestations of the psychosis can dissipate?
Yes, they can appear and disappear quickly and unpredictably. They may come and go over a period of time.
And are there any physical manifestations of PCP ingestion?
Sometimes there are, but not always.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, when there are, it can be things like slightly elevated blood pressure or being easily startled or sweating or shaking or aimless behavior, but that doesn't necessarily happen.
Now, in your career, have you treated people who have used PCP?
I can't recall for sure, but I may have in the course of early training when I spent time
I object
in
to anything after I can't recall for sure.
Objection sustained.
At any point in your training, did you come to treat people who were suffering from acute instances of drug abuse?
Yes.
And did that include any instances that you came to believe were from PCP abuse?
I object.
Overall.
It may have.
Is it the case that you have not gone back and looked at the particular cases?
I object. I object to the form of the question.
The
and I
objection
object.
sustained.
Now, do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, as to whether PCP ingestion can cause violent behavior?
Yes,
What's that opinion?
it can cause violent behavior.
And what's the basis for your opinion?
The basis is the known effects of PCP on brain chemistry, together with accumulated experience of many, many cases of PCP abuse that are reported in the literature.
object.
Will be sustained.
I'd ask the answer to be stricken.
What is actually found in the literature is what it's stricken.
Is part of the basis for your opinion your review of medical literature?
I
Yeah.
object.
Overruled.
Yes,
And is that something that you were familiar with before last fall,
yes,
and that you looked at in particular as a result of our request?
yes,
And you testified that the manifestations of the PCP use can be intermittent.
yes.
What's the basis for that opinion?
Again, the experience from reviewing this literature. on what-
Is that based on your experience, teaching, and research?
Yes,
And when you use the term intermittent, what do you mean by that?
that means that it comes and goes unpredictably.
Now, in terms of diagnosing someone with PCP psychosis, how would one go about doing that?
Well, you would like to have some reliable history of PCP exposure, either immediately or sometime in the past. You would also like to have measurement of the drug either in blood or urine.
Could you look at a person without any context to it and make a determination?
I object.
Sustained to the form of the question.
What conclusions could you draw, if any, from observing a person as to whether or not they were under the influence of PCP?
Only from observation, I don't think you could determine.
That's all. Thank you, Dr. Greenblatt.
Well, have you diagnosed anybody with PCP psychosis in relationship to this case?
No,
Were you provided any evidence by Mr. Rankin or Mr. Sultan in relationship to this case?
no,
And it's fair to say that prior to the fall of 2014, you yourself had no direct experience with people in PCP psychosis, true?
not true. As I mentioned, I may have had experience as an emergency room physician in the early 70s.
May have is not actual, isn't that correct, doctor?
Well, I answered the question.
The question is, may have does not equal having experience, isn't that
Well,
correct?
but my answer is may have.
Well, okay, so please tell us then, doctor, the circumstance under which you have direct experience with somebody with PCP psychosis.
I think I answered that. As an emergency room physician in the 70s, I treated drug abuse, alcoholism, heroin overdose, use of hallucinogens, and PCP may have been among those drugs. But since years have elapsed, I can't say for sure.
Right, and in fact, this isn't the first time you've ever testified in a courtroom, isn't that correct, doctor?
That is correct.
And on other occasions, including in an article that you published in the New England Law Review, you have repeatedly said that the only way to tell whether or not someone is under the influence of anything is to have a confirmed test, preferably and almost exclusively by the form of a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that was, I previously answered that.
Okay. And so you would need, would you not, in order to answer my question, an actual GCMS test related to someone who was experiencing some bad effect of a drug.
I would like to see chemical validation, yes.
And in fact, you've repeatedly said that's the only way to make that determination. Isn't that true?
I don't think I've repeatedly said that, but I would like to see a chemical determination,
Well, how
yes.
many times have you said that, Doctor?
I don't know, I don't
You
know.
published a whole article about it, did you not?
Yes, that had to do with drug testing.
Right.
In the
in fact,
context
in that
of, can I finish the
You
answer?
may finish. I
It has to
apologize,
do
Doctor.
with, that had to do with the context of drug testing for, let's say, pre-employment, when people are undergoing drug tests before starting a job to see whether they're drug abusers. And the point I made there is that if somebody is going to be accused of being a drug abuser, they should have a test that's validated, whether it's blood or urine.
And in fact, in that article, what you also said was that athletes should not be tested. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure I said that. I said that people should be tested if there is cause for testing, but I don't think that people should be randomly tested without cause. That's what I said.
In fact, your article is an argument against testing amateur and professional athletes. Isn't that correct?
If there is no cause for testing.
Well, at that time, you were suggesting that there was no reason to believe that steroids were actually having an effect on performance in athletics. Isn't that true?
No, that's not true.
Well,
I'm not sure I took that up. The point is that I don't think that people should be tested without cause because they're innocent. If there's cause, that's another story.
particularly athletes shouldn't be tested. That was your point. Isn't that correct?
I think it holds for athletes and anybody else.
Okay. And it's fair to say, just as you've described to us, you don't, prior to being contacted by counsel in this case, you had no confirmed case yourself through GCMS testing of a person who was in any potential psychoses due to PCP. Isn't that correct?
I think I answered that before. As a physician in the early 70s when I was in the emergency room, I treated drug overdosage, alcoholism, heroin abuse, and I may have treated PCP abuse, but I can't specifically recall.
And you wrote a single article related to that out of the 700-plus articles that you've described for us? This drug abuse observations that you made?
The article that I recall was written in the early 70s in the American Journal of Psychiatry.
You recall writing an article in 1974 titled Drug Abuse and the Emergency Room Physician.
That's correct.
Okay. And in that article, what you described is that an emergency room physician should be loath to use sedatives and tranquilizers in relationship to a person who's in a potential circumstance of a drug intoxication. Isn't that correct?
I don't recall.
It's fair to say that article had nothing to do with PCP. Isn't that true?
That I don't recall.
Okay. And so when you say you don't recall, you're telling us that there's no basis to conclude that there was anything about PCP in that article.
What I'm saying is I don't recall the content of the article.
Okay. Well, it's fair to say it didn't include anything about PCP.
I don't know. I haven't reviewed the content of the article.
Okay. Well, do you want to have an opportunity to do that?
Not my call.
Is there something that you can do to provide us with a positive answer about that, Doctor?
Positive answer to what?
One way or the other, whether or not it contained anything to do with PCP. Is there something that you can do?
If you want me to review it, I'll review it, but
Do you have it with you?
no,
You have access to it?
not here.
You knew you were coming to speak about PCP today, Doctor?
Yes?
Okay. And it's fair to say that these other articles that you've written, not a one of them has anything to do with PCP. Isn't that true?
That I don't recall.
Okay. You have with you your CV there.
Yes.
Mr. Rankin just provided it to you,
Correct.
right? Do you want to review that to see whether or not any article you've ever written has anything to do with PCP?
Well, I couldn't tell without seeing the article, particularly if they were written 40 years ago.
Okay. So when you say you don't know, essentially you have no memory that it does. Isn't that true?
I said I don't recall, which means I don't have a memory of if it did or it didn't.
Doctor, these articles that you've written, you've testified previously about the source of information on occasion that you get in order to write these 700 or so articles. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
You rely, all of these articles that you've written, they're not all your own original research, are they?
Well, the first 762 are.
You rely on information that other people have gathered, isn't that true?
Well, we rely principally on the research information that we've generated ourselves, but we consider what others have done.
Well, do you recall testifying in a case in California about the effects of a drug called Halcyon?
Yes. I will say I have testified about Halcyon in the past. I don't recall California.
You flew out to Los Angeles to testify in a case where the defendant's name was Yamaguchi. Do you recall that?
I can't say as I recall.
Okay. And you testified there as to the source of your articles on Halcyon. Isn't that correct?
I don't recall.
They relied on drug company research. Isn't that true?
That I don't recall, but I can tell you that we rely on all research to come to conclusions, no
Right.
matter who the sponsor is.
Right. And in fact, in that case, you testified that you couldn't even remember whether or not you examined the underlying data that you reported in your own article.
I don't remember, sir.
Well, you did testify to that, did
I
you not?
really don't remember.
Do you disagree with me that you
I
testified
didn't say
to that?
that. I said I don't remember.
Okay. So I guess the question, Doctor, is you have no memory about a number of these things. Can you tell us whether or not you write articles that are, these 700 and some articles that you've written, that are based on other people's data that you simply report?
If it's original research, it might involve other people's data, but essentially all of them are original analyses or original data that we've produced in our own laboratory or with our own research.
And you've testified in other cases that sometimes it takes you as little as 15 minutes to write those articles. Isn't that true?
No, I never said anything.
You never
like
said
that.
anything like that? Matter of
Not
hours
that
sometimes?
I can't imagine saying that. No.
A matter of hours sometimes to write these articles?
It takes a long time to write articles. I
Well,
don't
do you
really
recall
know.
previously testifying in other cases that particularly when you're relying on other people's data, you can write these articles fairly quickly?
I don't recall that.
Okay. None of these awards that you've ever received have anything to do with PCP, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you've never published any articles about PCP or PCP psychosis, isn't that true?
With the exception of the one or maybe more, but certainly the one that we discussed previously.
One or maybe more now?
Well, there may be others. I didn't go through everything that's
Well, would you
previously
accept,
written.
Doctor, that I've been through each of your 700 and some articles, and not a one of them have PCP?
I mean, I hear what you say. I don't know whether it's valid or not.
Okay, you've had an opportunity to go through your articles.
No, I haven't. I haven't done that.
What would the title potentially be of a different article that is related to PCP?
There is no way to tell.
And it's fair to say that prior, your testimony here now in front of the jury, that the effects of PCP psychosis can come and go quickly. That's different than what you just previously testified to before the jury came in, isn't that correct?
No, it can. Testify that it's unpredictable. It could come quickly. It could come slowly. You can't tell what's going to happen.
You previously testified that you have no idea how long it would last. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, but
Okay.
that's not what you asked. You asked about coming and going.
Well, that's what Mr. Rankin asked you. Do you recall that?
What am I supposed to recall? Tell me again.
That you just agreed with Mr. Rankin that it can come and go quickly.
It can come and go quickly. It can come and go slowly.
Right. But you previously said you have no idea how long it would last.
That's
You
correct.
recall that?
Yes.
So when you're testifying now that it can come and go quickly, that's different than what you previously testified to.
It is not at all different. It is the same.
Okay. Describe for us, please, Doctor, a person who is intoxicated by the effects of PCP, how do they appear, please?
They may appear normal, or they may have symptoms such as slightly elevated blood pressure, aimless movements, maybe sweating, maybe fast heart rate, maybe some shakiness or tremulousness.
Okay. And when you say they may appear normally, you'd agree with me then that absent a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer analysis, you couldn't opine anything about whether or not they're under the influence of PCP?
I'm sorry, what does the mass spectrometer have to do with?
If somebody appears normal,
Yes?
you'd have no understanding whether or not they're under the influence or intoxicated by PCP absent a GCMS.
Or a reliable history of ingestion.
And describe for us, doctor, these in PCP psychosis, is that different than PCP intoxication?
Well, it's all part of the same thing.
They just one leads to the next?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay. You'd agree with me, doctor, that there are plenty of other drugs and substances that are correlated with violence. Is that true?
There are others, yes.
Okay. And specifically, doctor, could you tell us whether or not the drug or the substance alcohol is correlated with violence?
There are reports of people committing violent acts after alcohol. The exact relationship is not really clear.
You'd agree with me that alcohol is much better understood and more easily studied than PCP, isn't that true?
Well, it's legal, and there's much more extensive exposure. I mean, everybody drinks alcohol.
And in fact, alcohol reduces inhibitions to violence, isn't that true?
No, alcohol reduces inhibition.
Somebody who drinks no longer is as inhibited to act in certain ways they were before, isn't that true?
Maybe.
And if they're violent, the violence is actually an extension of what they were before the inhibition went away, isn't that correct?
Could you say that again?
When a person under the influence of alcohol is violent, it's not that the alcohol has made them violent, it is that the alcohol has reduced their inhibition to acting in that way. Isn't that correct?
It may be that alcohol-related violence is just a release of violence that was already there.
That's thought to be the mechanism. Isn't that true?
That's a possible mechanism, yes.
And you'd agree with me, doctor, somebody who arms themselves, that is a person who has very little inhibition to violence. Isn't that true?
I don't know.
Okay. Doctor, what would cause somebody to leave from a club and go and retrieve a firearm from a car?
Objection, Order.
Well, what about marijuana, doctor?
Yes, what about it?
Do you have an opinion about marijuana
In what context?
in the context of violence?
Yes.
And what is that, doctor?
I don't know of any evidence that marijuana causes violent behavior.
And do you know, doctor, whether or not the use of marijuana and alcohol is related to lessening of an inhibition towards violence?
My understanding would be that if there were a lessening of inhibition, that it would be attributable to the alcohol.
Now, can you tell us, doctor, you described negative and positive aspects of psychosis, is that correct?
Yes.
And you indicated that there are a number of things that are both, first the negative symptoms and then the positive symptoms of psychosis, and then you finally got to, in some circumstances, there is harm done to the person themselves, or potentially harm done